I want to welcome you here gently, like opening a window on a quiet morning. Wherever you are right now, imagine that we are sitting in the same room, not rushed, not worried about time, just two people breathing in the same space. Today, I want to talk about a feeling many of us know, even if we rarely say it out loud, the moment when we think, I don't feel good enough for this job. It is a simple sentence, but it carries so much weight, so much history, so many unspoken fears. As you listen, you don't need to solve anything. You don't need to judge yourself. Just stay with me and let the story move like slow water around you. I remember a morning many years ago when I first stood in front of a real classroom as a teacher. The room was brighter than I expected, almost too bright, like light that exposes every small detail you wish could stay hidden. The desks were arranged in neat rows, each one carrying a different life, a different story I did not yet know. I arrived early, earlier than anyone else, because I could not trust myself to arrive calmly if I came at the normal time. My hands were slightly cold, my breathing just a little shallow, and in my chest there was a quiet but persistent voice saying, "You are not ready for this. You are pretending." I placed my notebook on the desk and pretended to organize it, though everything was already in place. I walked to the board and wrote my name, slowly, as if careful handwriting might make me more legitimate. Thomas. I stepped back and looked at it, and instead of feeling proud, I felt exposed, as if that simple name was asking me, "Are you really who you say you are?" I turned toward the empty chairs and imagined the students arriving, their faces, their expectations, their silent judgments. In that moment, the sentence formed clearly in my mind, "I don't feel good enough for this job." When the first student walked in, she smiled politely, unaware of the storm inside me. She sat near the window and placed her bag on the floor with a soft thud. More students came, one by one, filling the room with small movements, whispers, the scraping of chairs. I greeted them, my voice calm on the surface, but inside I was trembling. I began the lesson, explaining something simple about English greetings, and as I spoke, I felt two versions of myself at the same time. One version sounded confident, warm, steady. The other version watched from inside and whispered, "They will find you out." At some point, a student raised his hand and asked a question I had not prepared for. It was not a difficult question, but in that moment it felt like a spotlight. My mind went blank for a second. I smiled, bought myself time with a small breath, and answered slowly. The student nodded, satisfied, but my inner voice did not quiet down. Instead, it said, "You got lucky this time." After the class ended, I walked outside into the cold air and felt both relief and exhaustion. I kept replaying the lesson in my head, focusing only on the small imperfections, the moments where I hesitated, the sentences I could have said better. I told myself that a real teacher would not feel like this. A real teacher would be certain. A real teacher would not go home feeling like a fraud. Years later, I was sitting in a small cafe, preparing for another class, this time in a different country, with different students, a different version of my life. Rain was falling gently against the window, blurring the street into soft colors. I had my laptop open, but I was not really working. I was watching the rain, letting my thoughts drift. Across from me sat a young woman I had just met, a friend of a friend, someone who had recently started a new job in an office she had dreamed about for years. She told me quietly that she felt overwhelmed, that everyone around her seemed smarter, faster, more confident. She said, almost in a whisper, "I don't feel good enough for this job." As she spoke, I saw in her eyes the same expression I had seen in myself that first day in the classroom. Not laziness, not arrogance, but vulnerability, a deep fear of being seen as inadequate. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't say everything will be fine or you are amazing. Instead, I shared my own story of that first class, the cold hands, the bright room, the trembling inside. As I spoke, I noticed how familiar that feeling still was, even after years of teaching. It had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape, like a shadow that moves, but never leaves. Sitting there with her, listening to the rain, I realized something important. That sentence, "I don't feel good enough for this job," is not always a weakness. Sometimes it is a sign that we care deeply, that we respect the responsibility in front of us, that we want to do well. It is not only fear, it is also humility. As you think about that phrase in English, notice how it sounds. I don't feel good enough for this job. There is softness in it, a personal honesty. It is not saying I am not good. It is saying I don't feel good enough, which is different. Feelings shift. They are not permanent. They are like weather passing through your inner world. I often return to that memory of the empty classroom before the students arrived. The quiet, the brightness, the echo of my footsteps. In that stillness, I was not yet a teacher in anyone else's eyes. I was just a person standing at the front of a room, holding a notebook, carrying doubts. And maybe that is where real teaching begins, not with certainty, but with awareness of our own uncertainty. When I think about language learning, I see a similar pattern. Many people sit in front of English and feel that same sentence forming inside them. I don't feel good enough to speak. I don't feel good enough to make mistakes in front of others. I don't feel good enough to be understood. The job, in this case, is not only a profession, it is the job of expressing yourself, of taking up space in another language. I remember one student, Maria, who would always sit quietly at the back of the room. Her English was actually quite strong, but she rarely spoke. One day, after class, she stayed behind and told me she felt like an imposter when she tried to speak. She said that in her head, her English sounded messy, unfinished, not worthy of being heard. I listened, really listened. And then I told her about my first class, about the trembling, about the inner voice. She smiled softly and said she never imagined a teacher could feel that way. In that moment, I saw how our shared vulnerability created a bridge between us, not a bridge of perfect grammar, but a bridge of human experience. There is another scene that stays with me. Late one evening, I was walking home after a long day of teaching. The streets were quiet, the city breathing slowly. My reflection appeared in shop windows as I passed, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted by lights. I thought about how many people were walking around carrying that same feeling of not being enough. In jobs, in relationships, in life. I stopped by a small park and sat on a bench beneath a tree. The leaves moved gently in the night breeze, whispering to each other in a language older than words. I closed my eyes and noticed my own breath, in and out, steady and real. In that moment, I asked myself a simple question. What does it really mean to be good enough? The thought came quietly. Maybe being good enough does not mean being perfect. Maybe it means showing up, even when you are afraid. Maybe it means trying, even when you doubt yourself. Maybe it means learning in public, making mistakes, and still continuing. Back in the classroom, I began to notice how often students used similar expressions. I'm not ready. I'm not confident. I'm not good at English. Each sentence carried the same emotional weight as I don't feel good enough for this job. They were not just statements about language. They were statements about identity. When we say, I don't feel good enough, we are revealing something tender. We are admitting that we care, that we want to belong, that we want to be seen as capable. That admission is not a failure. It is a deeply human moment. I think about how often we measure ourselves against invisible standards. In a job, we compare ourselves to colleagues who seem effortlessly competent. In English, we compare ourselves to native speakers, to fluent influencers, to polished voices on the internet. We rarely compare ourselves to our past selves, to how far we have already come. Sometimes I sit with students and simply let them speak, without correcting every small error. I watch their faces as they search for words, hesitate, breathe, and continue. In those moments, I see courage. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet courage of someone stepping forward despite feeling unready. I think back to that first day again, standing in the bright classroom. If I could speak to that younger version of myself, I would not tell him to stop feeling inadequate. I would tell him that feeling is part of the journey. I would tell him that being unsure does not make him unqualified. It makes him attentive. There is a subtle beauty in the English phrase, I don't feel good enough for this job. It invites reflection rather than judgment. It opens a space to explore your inner world. You are not declaring defeat. You are naming your experience. As I sit here now, imagining you listening, I wonder if you have felt this in your own life, perhaps in a workplace, in a new role, in a conversation in English, or even in your personal life. That moment when your chest tightens slightly and you think, maybe I am not the right person for this. I have felt it many times since that first class. Before important presentations, before difficult conversations, before new beginnings. Each time, the feeling returns, familiar but not identical. And each time, I try to meet it with a little more kindness. I remember another student, Ahmed, who had just started working in an international company. He came to me one afternoon looking tired. He said that in meetings, he felt small, that his English was not fast enough, that he worried people would see him as less capable. He said, almost painfully, I don't feel good enough for this job. We sat together in silence for a moment. Then I asked him to describe one meeting in detail, not focusing on language, but on what he noticed. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, describing the room, the voices, his heartbeat. As he spoke, his story became more than a complaint. It became a lived experience, rich and real. I could see him realizing that he was not simply inadequate. He was navigating complexity, culture, pressure, and a second language all at once. That realization did not erase his doubt, but it transformed it into something more compassionate. When I teach, I often think that my role is not only to explain grammar or correct pronunciation. It is to sit beside people in moments like these, to remind them that their feelings are valid, that growth is messy, that language learning mirrors life. Sometimes, late at night, I reflect on my own journey with English, even though it is my native language. I think about how often I have felt not good enough in different ways. As a teacher, as a friend, as a person trying to live meaningfully. That sentence is not tied to one job or one moment. It is part of the human condition. There is a gentle power in naming it. When you say, "I don't feel good enough for this job," you are not surrendering. You are bringing your inner world into the light, and in that light, something can shift. I imagine you perhaps sitting somewhere right now, listening, maybe in your room, on a bus, walking outside, or resting on a couch. You might be thinking of your own version of this feeling. A meeting you are anxious about, a conversation in English you are avoiding, a responsibility that feels too big. If you let that thought rest in your mind without fighting it, you might notice something subtle. The feeling is there, but you are still here too. Breathing, listening, reflecting. You are not swallowed by it. You are observing it. I often tell myself that being good enough is not a fixed state you arrive at one day. It is a relationship you build with yourself over time. It grows through small acts of honesty, patience, and courage. In that cafe with the young woman, as the rain continued to fall, we did not solve her problem. She still had to go to work the next day. But something softened between us. She realized she was not alone in her doubt. And in that realization, a little strength emerged. I think about how language can carry that same softness. When you speak in English, you are not just producing words, you are revealing parts of yourself. And sometimes that feels terrifying, but it is also where connection lives. I return again to the empty classroom in my memory. The sunlight on the desks, the chalk dust in the air, my name written on the board. I see now that the version of me who felt not good enough was not a failure. He was a beginner in something meaningful. Maybe that is true for you too. Maybe you are not failing. Maybe you are simply at the beginning of something that matters. I think often that learning English is not just about sounding correct. It is about learning to speak even when you feel imperfect, to communicate even when you doubt yourself, to be human in another language. Sometimes I feel grateful for that old feeling of inadequacy because it keeps me humble, attentive, and empathetic. It reminds me that my students are not just struggling with vocabulary or pronunciation. They are wrestling with their sense of self. As this journey of reflection slowly unfolds, I invite you to sit with that sentence once more, not as a verdict, but as a starting point. I don't feel good enough for this job. Notice how it sits in your body, in your mind, in your heart. I imagine a future version of you, perhaps a few years from now, looking back at this moment. That future you might still feel doubts, but they will be different. You will have more experience, more resilience, more compassion for yourself. In the same way, the future version of me looks back at that first classroom and feels tenderness rather than embarrassment. I see a young teacher trying his best, scared but still standing there. As we near the end of this quiet conversation, I want to leave you with a gentle thought. Feeling not good enough does not disqualify you. It humanizes you. It connects you to millions of others who have stood in bright rooms, sat in rainy cafes, or walked under silent trees, carrying the same feeling. You are not just learning English. You are learning how to navigate doubt, how to speak with vulnerability, how to grow without losing yourself. I think about another morning, much later in my career, when I stood not in a classroom, but in a conference room with glass walls that made everything feel exposed. The table was long, polished, almost too perfect, and around it sat people far more experienced than me in different fields. They spoke quickly, confidently, their English sharp and precise. I was there as a language consultant, but in that moment, the old feeling returned quietly, like a familiar guest knocking at the door. I remember my palms resting flat on the table, feeling the cool surface beneath them. My mind kept repeating, "You don't belong here. You are out of your depth." And yet, from the outside, I must have looked composed, perhaps even relaxed. That contrast between how we appear and how we feel is something I have come to know very well. When my turn came to speak, I didn't rush. I let the room settle for a second, took a slow breath, and began. As I spoke, I could feel my heartbeat, steady but present, like a quiet drum beneath my words. I noticed something subtle. The more I accepted the feeling of not being good enough, the less power it had over me. It was still there, but it was no longer controlling me. After the meeting, as I walked down a long corridor lined with windows, sunlight pouring in, I thought about how often we mistake confidence for absence of doubt. We imagine that capable people never feel insecure, that successful people never question themselves. But in my experience, many of the most thoughtful, compassionate, and skilled people I have met carry that same inner uncertainty. They just have learned how to walk alongside it. There is a memory from my childhood that connects to all of this. I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing at the edge of a deep swimming pool. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, beautiful but intimidating. My friends were already in the pool, laughing, splashing, moving freely through the water. I stood there frozen, thinking, I'm not brave enough. I'm not ready. I will fail. My father sat nearby, watching quietly. He didn't push me, didn't shout encouragement, didn't say you must jump. Instead, after a while, he simply said, you don't have to jump today. You can stand there and feel what this is like. That simple permission shifted something inside me. I stayed there a little longer, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, listening to the water, noticing my fear, and then, almost without deciding, I stepped forward and slipped into the pool. The water was colder than I expected, but it held me. I think about that moment often when I work with students who feel they are not good enough to speak English. They stand at the edge of the pool, watching others move with ease, convinced they will sink. My role is not to force them in, but to sit beside them, to help them breathe, to remind them that hesitation is not failure. Language, like water, can feel overwhelming when you look at it from the outside. But once you step in, even slowly, you discover that it can carry you, that you can learn its rhythm, that you can move within it. I remember a late evening lesson with a student named Lynn. She worked during the day and came to class exhausted, but determined. One night, she confessed that she felt ashamed of her accent, that she avoided speaking in meetings because she worried people would judge her. She said, in a voice barely above a whisper, I don't feel good enough to speak English at work. We didn't analyze grammar. We didn't practice pronunciation drills. Instead, I asked her to tell me about her journey in English. Slowly, without worrying about mistakes. She spoke about her hometown, her family, her dreams, her struggles. As she spoke, her English was not perfect, but it was real, alive, full of feeling. At one point, she stopped and apologized for her English. I gently asked her to notice something. Her story had been clear, moving, understandable. The job of language, in that moment, was not perfection. It was connection. As I listened to her, I saw again how deeply intertwined language and self-worth are. When we say, "I don't feel good enough for this job," we are often really saying, "I don't feel good enough as a person in this space." That is a heavy burden to carry alone. There is a quiet beauty in recognizing that this feeling is not unique to you. Across cultures, professions, and languages, people stand in their own versions of that bright classroom, that glass conference room, that deep swimming pool. Sometimes, late at night, I sit at my desk with a cup of tea growing cold beside me, reflecting on my own inner voice. It still speaks, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply. It still questions my abilities, my worth, my place. But over time, I have learned to listen differently. Instead of arguing with it, I try to understand what it is trying to protect me from. Often, it is fear of embarrassment, fear of rejection, fear of being exposed. These are not shameful fears. They are deeply human. I think about how English learning mirrors this inner journey. At first, you might feel exposed when you speak, as if every mistake reveals something inadequate about you. But gradually, you learn that mistakes are not cracks in your worth. They are simply part of the process of growth. I recall another scene, this time on a train traveling through the countryside. The landscape passed by slowly, green fields stretching toward the horizon, small houses dotted along the way. Across from me sat a man in his 50s, reading quietly. After a while, we began to talk. He told me he had recently changed careers after decades in one field. He admitted that, even at his age, he felt like a beginner again, like he was pretending to belong in his new job. His words struck me deeply. Here was someone with so much life experience, still feeling not good enough. It reminded me that this feeling does not disappear with time. It simply evolves. As the train rattled gently along the tracks, I realized that maybe our relationship with inadequacy is not something to fix, but something to understand. It is like a companion on the journey, sometimes heavy, sometimes quiet, always present. When I teach, I try to create a space where students can bring that feeling into the room without shame. A space where saying "I don't feel good enough" is not a confession of failure, but a starting point for honest conversation. I often ask students to describe moments in their lives when they felt this way. Not to analyze them, but to feel them again, to notice the sensations, the thoughts, the emotions. In doing so, they begin to see that these moments are part of a larger story, not the definition of who they are. There is something almost poetic about the English phrase itself. "I don't feel good enough for this job." It contains vulnerability, humility, and a desire to do well. It is not aggressive, not self-pitying, but quietly honest. Sometimes, I encourage students to say it out loud, slowly, just to hear how it sounds. Not as a declaration of defeat, but as a way of acknowledging their inner world. There is a strange relief in naming something you have carried silently. I imagine you, wherever you are, perhaps feeling a similar tension in your own life. Maybe you are preparing for an interview, a presentation, a conversation in English, or a new responsibility. That familiar whisper might be there, telling you that you are not enough. I want you to picture yourself standing at the edge of that pool again, feeling the warmth of the sun, hearing the water move. You don't have to jump. You don't have to prove anything. You can simply stand there and notice. And then, when you are ready, you can take one small step forward. Not a leap, not a dramatic act, just a gentle movement. In language, that might mean speaking one sentence, asking one question, sharing one thought. I think about how growth often happens in these small, quiet moments, not in grand declarations. A single sentence spoken with honesty can carry more meaning than a perfect speech. As I reflect on my own journey, I see how many times I have grown precisely because I felt not good enough and still showed up. That combination of doubt and courage has shaped me more than any moment of pure confidence. I remember teaching a class once where a student suddenly stopped speaking and tears welled in her eyes. She had been trying so hard to be perfect that the pressure became too much. In that moment, we didn't focus on English. We focused on breathing, on being present, on allowing herself to feel without judgment. After a few minutes, she whispered, "I'm tired of pretending I'm confident. I don't feel good enough most days." The room grew very quiet. Other students nodded gently, some with their own eyes shining. In that shared silence, something powerful emerged. They were no longer just language learners competing silently with each other. They were human beings recognizing their common vulnerability. I think that is one of the deepest lessons of language learning. It is not just about communication. It is about connection, empathy, and understanding our shared humanity. As this long reflection continues, like a river flowing through different landscapes, the central theme remains the same. That feeling of not being good enough is not an enemy. It is a messenger, inviting you to slow down, to be honest, to grow with awareness. Sometimes I feel that the quieter moments in life teach us the most. Sitting alone in a cafe watching rain, standing in an empty classroom before students arrive, walking under trees at night, or listening to your own breath. In those moments, language becomes less about performance and more about presence. English is not something you must master to prove your worth. It is a tool you use to express your inner world, imperfect and beautiful as it is. I imagine you now, perhaps closing your eyes for a moment, feeling your own heartbeat, noticing your own thoughts. Maybe the sentence appears again. "I don't feel good enough for this job." Let it be there without fighting it. Then, gently, add another thought beside it, and still, I am here, still breathing, still trying, still learning. That is where growth lives, in the space between doubt and action, between fear and curiosity, between silence and speech. I think sometimes that the most important job any of us has is not our career title, but the ongoing work of becoming more compassionate toward ourselves. Language can be part of that work, a mirror in which we see our inner struggles reflected. As we move toward the end of this shared journey, I want you to carry with you not a sense of pressure, but a sense of gentle possibility. You do not have to feel good enough all the time to move forward. You just have to be willing to keep walking. I return one last time to that first classroom in my memory. The sunlight, the empty desks, the name on the board. I see now that the man who stood there, trembling slightly, was not unqualified. He was simply at the beginning of something meaningful. Perhaps you, too, are at the beginning of something, even if you have been working or learning for years. Every new challenge is a beginning in its own way. You are not just learning English. You are learning how to sit with doubt, how to speak with vulnerability, how to grow without losing your softness. There is one more image that returns to me often, especially when I sit with students who feel they are not enough. It is not a classroom, not a cafe, not a conference room. It is a simple moment by the sea. I was standing on a beach at dawn, the sky pale and quiet, The horizon blurred between water and air. The tide was moving slowly, breathing in and out as if the ocean itself were alive in the same way we are. My shoes were off, my feet sinking slightly into the cool, damp sand. I remember feeling small, not in a painful way, but in a deeply human way, as if I were a tiny part of something vast and ongoing. As I watched the waves arrive and disappear, I thought about how every wave is imperfect. Some are strong, some are gentle, some break too early, some carry far. Yet together they form something beautiful. No single wave has to be perfect for the ocean to be magnificent. In that moment, I realized that our lives are much the same. Our careers, our language learning, our relationships, our attempts to grow, they are all made of countless small, imperfect moments. Feeling not good enough is just one kind of wave. It rises, it falls, it shapes the shoreline of who we are. I carried that thought back into my teaching. When a student struggles to find a word, I see not failure, but a wave learning how to move. When someone hesitates in English, I see not weakness, but the careful shaping of meaning. When someone says quietly, "I don't feel good enough for this job," I hear not defeat, but honesty. I remember sitting with a group of students once, late in the evening, the classroom lights soft and warm. We were not doing a formal lesson. We were simply talking about life. One by one, they shared moments when they felt inadequate. At work, in love, in family, in language. As they spoke, something shifted in the room. The air became lighter, more open, more compassionate. One student said, after listening to others, that she had always thought she was the only one who felt this way. Another admitted that pretending to be confident all the time was exhausting. A third realized that her fear of speaking English came not from the language itself, but from a deeper fear of being judged. I sat there quietly, feeling grateful for their courage. In those moments, teaching felt less like a job and more like a shared human experience. I was not standing above them as an expert. I was walking beside them, carrying my own doubts, my own history, my own voice. Sometimes, when I am alone, I still feel that old sentence whispering in my mind, in different forms. I'm not ready. I'm not enough. I don't belong. But over time, I have learned to meet that whisper with curiosity rather than panic. I ask myself gently, what are you afraid of right now? What do you need? What would kindness look like in this moment? Often, the answer is not to become perfect, but to slow down, to breathe, to be present. Language learning has taught me something profound about this process. You cannot force fluency by harsh self-criticism. You grow by gentle, consistent practice, by allowing yourself to speak imperfectly, by trusting that clarity will come with time. In the same way, you cannot force yourself to feel good enough by simply telling yourself to be confident. Confidence grows gradually through small experiences of showing up, trying, reflecting, and continuing. I think about how many people listen to podcasts like this one, hoping not only to improve their English, but to feel less alone in their struggles. That is why I speak slowly, gently, personally, not to sound wise, but to create a space where you can breathe. Perhaps you have been carrying this feeling of not being good enough for a long time. Perhaps it follows you into meetings, into conversations, into classrooms, into your own inner thoughts. You do not need to banish it today. You do not need to win a battle against it. Instead, Imagine placing that feeling beside you, like a quiet companion on a long walk. You can notice it without letting it lead. You can acknowledge it without letting it define you. I return once more to that young version of me in the bright classroom. If I could sit beside him now, I would not tell him to be braver. I would tell him to be kinder to himself. I would say, "It is okay to feel this way. It means you care. It means you are trying." And perhaps that is the most important message I want to leave you with. Feeling not good enough does not mean you are not capable. Often, it means you are stepping into something meaningful. In English, in work, in life, growth rarely happens in comfort. It happens in that delicate space where you feel slightly uncertain, slightly vulnerable, but still willing to move forward. As you continue your own journey, I hope you remember that your voice matters, even when it trembles. Your English matters, even when it is imperfect. Your presence matters, even when you feel small. Imagine again the ocean, the waves, the endless movement. You are one wave among many, unique, necessary, part of something larger. You do not have to be the biggest or the strongest. You simply have to keep moving, keep flowing, keep becoming. And when the feeling returns, because it will, you can meet it with the same gentleness you would offer a friend. You can say, "I see you. I hear you. But I am still here." You are not just learning English. You are learning how to stand in your life with honesty, how to speak from your heart, how to grow without losing your softness. As this quiet journey comes to a close, I sit with gratitude for you, for your willingness to listen, to reflect, to feel. I imagine you carrying these thoughts into your day, into your conversations, into your learning. Wherever your path leads, remember that doubt does not disqualify you. It shapes you. It teaches you. It makes your courage more real. This is English with Thomas. I'm Thomas. Keep speaking, keep growing, and keep trusting yourself.